My first books were about far less famous women than Elizabeth Cady Stanton. I am not by inclination or profession a biographer. Nevertheless, for the past few years, I've spoken about Stanton's life, about her bold and outrageous demands for women's full equality, about women's right to own property, to get an education, to seek a divorce, to exercise a vote, to speak out. The very thing Stanton was referring to when she said, "This sounds like a very radical proposition now, but be sure that one day, in the future, Americans will ask how these things could ever have been otherwise." Indeed, although Stanton's demands are no longer controversial, I still believe that there was simply no one else like Elizabeth Cady Stanton. As the founding philosopher for the movement for women's rights, she was a leading activist intellectual in a generation that was packed with them. She belongs by any measure in the pantheon of people who founded this nation and who shaped it, and it's been a pleasure to introduce her to people who knew little about her life. I've also spoken and written, and I did in the biography, and I will some today, about my arguments with Stanton. And it's here that I often find myself in trouble with my own students and with various Stanton fans in my audiences. Stanton was a complex person, as infuriating as she was fascinating. She was brilliant, charming, and charismatic, as well as self-righteous, intimidating, and astonishingly self-confident. The mother of 7 children, an advocate of liberalized divorce laws, and a skeptic about religion, she comes through her 87 years as larger than life, a woman driven by her commitment to rouse herself and everyone else to rethink and remake women's status in politics, law, religion, and marriage. At the same time, Elizabeth Cady Stanton made comments that were so racist that they still can leave us speechless, and historians still argue about their significance. Where I differ from many historians is in arguing, and I'll make that argument today, that Stanton's racism and elitism were not merely warts, but reflected a thread in her thinking that was pervasive, long-standing, and that continues to limit how we think about Stanton and feminism today. I'm still working through the challenges posed by Stanton's place as a foundational thinker in this country's past, while holding her responsible for her and many of our limitations. My own students do not like it when I talk this way about Stanton. They want heroes. Who doesn't? And they prefer their heroes to be uncomplicated, and if not perfect, at least justified in their imperfections. Still, it seems to me that it's my job to teach them both about American history, which they see as just the facts, and to think historically, to recognize that history is complicated, that it requires that we be tourists among the people we study, among people we can't possibly understand, and at the same time, try to understand ourselves and our own society in more complex ways. So here's what I'd like to do today. First, I will talk very briefly about who Elizabeth Cady Stanton was. I assume that many of you are at least somewhat familiar with her life, and I also know that you have my book. But I will say that by far the biggest surprise for me in writing this biography was how many people didn't know who she was. The question, who was she, which I got all the time from well-educated Americans, of course it shows that we don't know much about women's history. But it also highlights that the ideas that Elizabeth Cady Stanton promoted so passionately in her own time are utterly commonplace in ours. Try getting girls and young women, all those non-feminists, I do this with my students all the time, try getting girls and young women to defend keeping women, because they are women, out of colleges or professions, trapped in hateful marriages, unable to earn or inherit or control money, and barred from voting and holding office. For virtually every American alive today, these are ordinary common sense ideas. Although, the first time I typed a sentence like that when I was first working on this book, several years ago, as soon as I had typed it, my daughter called from college to say that she had gone to hear Ann Coulter speak, and that Coulter had declared herself against the rash experiment of women's suffrage. So when I say all Americans share this, I realize I have to always make exceptions. There are always some, but still. That these ideas are so mainstream, so essentially non-negotiable, is to an astonishing degree because of Stanton's life work. In any case, I'll speak briefly about her life. I'm happy to answer questions later on. Of course, I hope you'll read my book. Second, I want to talk about Stanton's distressing failings, especially in the post-Civil War debate over the 15th Amendment to the U.S. Constitution and black men's voting rights. And I hope we'll have a discussion maybe later about what this means for feminism and how we might use these debates to teach and think about history. Okay. Elizabeth Cady Stanton, I have to learn to use this thing. Elizabeth Cady Stanton was born in Johnstown, New York in 1815. That's her mother. The daughter of Daniel and Margaret Livingston Cady. Her father, who became a judge, was wealthy. He owned several slaves and a lot of land. He was well-connected and deeply conservative, especially as his daughter recalled on matters of gender. Stanton's most vivid and oft-repeated story was that of a boisterous and rebellious little girl, 11 years old, whose only living brother had just died. Distraught, she crawled into her father's lap, hoping to give and receive comfort. He put his arm around her and sighed, "Oh, my daughter, I wish you were a boy." The sting of the father's remark lingers. Many girls and women can relate to the insult. Elizabeth Cady, as it turned out, had more than enough reserves of self-esteem to survive the slap, though she never forgot it. And she retained a strong sense of insult and exclusion. When the boys she had surpassed in the local school went off to Union College, she was unable to go to college, and as she remembered it, her vexation and mortification knew no bounds. If Elizabeth Cady had not this is what she looked like as a young woman, remarkably boyish given the times. If Elizabeth Cady had not turned that sense of exclusion into a philosophy of women's rights, we might simply shrug off her teenage self-absorption. But the moral that she took from these childhood affronts was enormous. She recognized that society's preference for boys dwarfed girls' lives, limited their opportunities, and was used to justify the denial of their rights. Elizabeth Cady's story was not merely one of exclusion, although she often told it that way. She received the best education available to girls at the time at the Troy Female Seminary, but her most formative experiences were in her father's, the judge's, law library, where she developed an acute sense of the law, the power of the law, to make and remake people's status. She loved arguing with the law students who teased her about women's subordinate status under the law. You know, there are stories in her memoir of these young men saying to her, "You know, if I married you, everything you have, even your Christmas presents, would be mine. I would own them." You know, she described this kind of teasing as a firing up of her indignation, already well honed. She always believed that politics and the law were the best route to social change. The popular view of her era, that religious conversion was the surest route to social perfection, never swept her up, as it did many of her contemporaries. After she married the anti-slavery lecturer and activist Henry Brewster Stanton, and she came to share his view that electoral politics, voting, offered an important route to ending slavery, and it was no great stretch for her, intellectually speaking, to decide that the vote was an essential marker of women's subordination, a tool and a symbol they required to be full and equal citizens of the United States. It's a little hard to imagine how scary this was, though I have an exercise I do with my students to try to imagine it. We can talk about that later if you like, and I actually think would work with younger students as well. To many, Elizabeth Cady Stanton was a dangerous radical whose ideas would turn the world on its ears. In Stanton's day, the prevailing ideology placed white, middle-class, Protestant women in a so-called private sphere, and held that their duties were best expressed in a religious, not political realm. The very safety of the republic, people declared, lay in women's moral influence over the poor, the foreign, and the fallen. In a political climate that claimed that men acquired their rights through a political compact, and that women gained theirs through marriage and Christianity, Elizabeth Cady Stanton's views threatened the stability of the nation itself. I have a cartoon here that's from a later era, but it gets some of the point across. This is from a much later era, and yet this kind of logic continued to pervade thinking about women's rights. The home or the street corner for woman? Vote no on women's suffrage. You know, this notion that if women were given full political rights, the whole world was going to be turned into a brothel was pervasive in Stanton's time and continued, you know, in different ways into our own, but certainly through gaining women's suffrage. But while many horrified observers claimed that women's rights went against God and nature, there was also that irritating strand in American political thought that declared the nation's commitment to justice and equality under the law. What Stanton recognized, and I think she was brilliant at this, was that granting women their rights, including the right to vote, although never only that, would simply be the fulfillment of the nation's revolutionary inheritance. Stanton's radical demand for women's suffrage, in other words, meshed perfectly with the nation's liberal ideals, and she knew it. Like the men we call the nation's founding fathers, Stanton took the simple truth that women had been denied their inalienable rights and wove it into a philosophy of rights that changed the world. These ideas were threatening for precisely the reason that they now seem so safe, so mainstream. They were rational, they were patriotic, they were American. It's part of why the arguments against women's suffrage petered out long before cartoons like this, or broadsides like this, were done. Let's see. This is a picture of the Seneca Falls Convention in 1848, a drawing made after the time. That's the famous convention where Stanton offered the Declaration of Sentiments and demanded women, many rights for women, including the right to vote. So while the notion that women be treated as individuals with the same rights as men is now barely up to question, the document that Stanton and her friends produced in 1848, the Seneca Falls Declaration of Sentiments, was stunning. A foundational text in American democratic ideals. Its language, careful and deliberate, made these dangerous radicals impossible to ignore. It should sound familiar. It would probably sound familiar even to many of your certainly older students. We hold these truths to be self-evident, Stanton read aloud, that all men and women are created equal. Like much of Stanton's thinking, the Declaration of Sentiments was not entirely original, but also like her, it displayed spectacular breadth of thought and imagination. By adopting the language of the nation's most sacred text, Stanton simply reminded Americans that their revolution had left unfinished business and urged them to do better. It underscored Stanton's conviction that women's rights fit squarely within the nation's traditions of equality and rebellion, that the pursuit of happiness itself had been refused women. I have great difficulty convincing my students that there was anything radical or outrageous or even new in the Declaration of Sentiments. But at the time, all this talk about women as independent, rights-bearing citizens left its listeners, supporters, as well as appalled opponents, breathless. Some newspaper editors could only sputter incoherently with outrage. Characteristically, rather than discuss the actual issues at hand, they resorted to emotional outbursts against the women's looks, clothing, and marriage prospects. Stanton's words can still, if we pay attention, leave us astonished at how radical and yet how deeply rooted in the nation's soil the promise of equal rights is. They remind us again of the radical potential of the defense of individual rights, including, but again, never only, the right to vote. As for Stanton, she never focused for long on any one idea. She disagreed with her friend Susan B. Anthony, who came to believe that winning the vote should be their only important goal. And she was brilliant at expanding these fundamentally liberal views of women's rights to a radical critique of religious teachings, of the marriage contract, and of women's sexual subordination to men. We live in a world that remains deeply gendered, with women disproportionately represented among the poor, the illiterate, the victimized, and the powerless, and with educated professional women insisting that they have chosen as their primary job being mothers. But we cannot, any of us in this room, imagine our lives without the work that Stanton did. Yet, my students start to roll their eyes at me always saying but after I've said something that makes them happy. Yet, Elizabeth Cady Stanton's legacy is much more complicated than all this good news might suggest. No one who wants to simply celebrate Stanton has enjoyed my book. An ugly streak of elitism and racism runs through her writing and speaking, becoming most apparent in the post-Civil War debates about black men's suffrage. These debates, which still raise historians' hackles, complicate Stanton's ideas and the women's movement's victories in ways Americans still have not fully addressed. For feminists, I think, they show the dangers of a feminism based entirely on individualism, one that ignores the group and community interests at stake, a point I have been a spectacular failure at getting across to my students, and which we can talk about later if you like. But for all of us, they challenge our best hopes that our heroes and heroines were always right and that their admirable positions always outweighed their failings. Elizabeth Cady Stanton considered herself the very cutting edge of American radicalism. The first, she thought, to imagine and speak out for women's rights, and the most consistent supporter of their complete equality, legally and politically. There is, of course, some truth to that, but ideas never emerge in a vacuum, and Stanton's world was peopled by radicals and reformers of many kinds. Not one person. Okay, this is the list of people who attended the Seneca Falls Convention. Not one person who attended the Seneca Falls Convention in 1848 was hearing about women's rights for the first time. By the 1840s, newspaper editors, ministers, educators, legislators, and reformers had been debating the issue of women's rights for years, and some communities fairly buzzed with the talk. The conversation had been loudest and most contentious within the anti-slavery movement, and it was abolitionists, men and women both, who gathered in Seneca Falls to declare themselves in favor of the complete civil and political equality of women. Textbooks and tributes to leading American women, those little boxes in the textbooks that set these issues aside from what the writers of the textbooks think really matters, right? Textbooks and tributes invariably describe Stanton as a devoted abolitionist. And it's certainly true that the anti-slavery community provided the inspiration and support that helped launch Stanton's career. Still, the place of anti-slavery in Stanton's life was complicated, and she took a markedly different path from many of her friends. At first it was simple. In the late 1830s, that's where the Seneca Falls Convention took place. It's now a National Women's Rights Historic Park in Seneca Falls. There's Henry. In the late 1830s, a young Elizabeth Cady, privileged and flirtatious and argumentative, was introduced both to abolitionism and to the noted anti-slavery lecturer, Henry Brewster Stanton, at the home of her cousin, the wealthy radical Gerrit Smith. From the first, the personal and political converged. How she thrilled to hear that man talk about the evils of slavery. After a stormy flirtation, her father was not happy about this. I mean, the man was an anti-slavery lecturer. It's not really a career goal. After a stormy flirtation, the two married and headed on their honeymoon to the World Anti-Slavery Convention in London, where the young Mrs. Stanton was drawn to an impressive community of pro-women's rights abolitionists, including the Quaker leader, Lucretia Mott. This is her much older, but I think it's a beautiful picture. That trip was, as Stanton later told the group, the major event in her political education. Elizabeth Cady Stanton soaked up learning like a sponge. Clearly, her experiences in the school of abolitionism made plausible her own rocketing analysis and career. But Stanton, though she moved in abolitionist circles, attended anti-slavery lectures, and counted many abolitionists among her friends, was more a fellow traveler than a convert. What Stanton loved was the talk and the excitement of being at the center of the action, but she comes off as a bit of a dilettante and an observer. I attend all sorts and sizes of meetings and lectures, she wrote Elizabeth Neal happily from Boston. I consider myself in a kind of moral museum, and I find that this Boston affords as many curiosities in her way as does the British Museum in its. She thrived in the company of strong-minded women and silver-tongued lecturers she found there. She breathed in their passion and their oratory. But she was never really one of them, and she knew it. In most descriptions of her life, including the one she told, 3 decades of anti-slavery struggle serve mostly as backdrop, as an important, even essential lesson in women's own status, degradations, and rights. Even during her visit to London in 1840, Stanton struck anti-slavery leaders as a fearless woman who, as the anti-slavery leader William Lloyd Garrison put it, goes for women's rights with all her soul. 8 years before the convention at Seneca Falls. So 8 years later, Seneca Falls offered Stanton an outlet in which to shape and express a single-minded focus on women's rights. Elizabeth Cady Stanton lived amid a radical community, and of course she opposed slavery. But unlike her anti-slavery friends, she never saw slavery or racism as the fissures in American society that demanded her undivided attention. While the anti-slavery movement offered Stanton an education and a constituency, her zeal for abolitionism was restrained. She remained remarkably calm in the face of the hideous brutalities of slavery and racism. In part because Stanton remained aloof from anti-slavery passions, she was able to devote her considerable intellectual gifts to an analysis of women's status, including their votelessness, as the central problem for American democracy. Essentially, she invented what I've come to call standalone feminism. Other passionate supporters of women's rights also believed in women's rights, but they believed their primary obligation was ending slavery, and after the Civil War, ensuring that African Americans had the means to protect their newly gained rights. Stanton considered them merely timid. It seems to me that Stanton's rather tepid anti-slavery convictions help explain the choices she made after the Civil War. It was then that radicals differed about whether to support a 15th Amendment that granted black men voting rights, or to hold out for an amendment that would give voting rights to all adults. The conflict, as Stanton and Anthony saw it, and many historians have agreed, was between their own principled commitment to universal rights on the one hand, and their colleagues' apparent selling out to a political party that needed only the votes of men. Elizabeth Cady Stanton's rhetoric in behalf of universal rights sounded wonderful on the stump. Some tell us that this is not the time for women to make the demand, that this is the Negro's hour, she declared in 1867. No, my friends, this is the nation's hour. This is the hour to settle what are the rights of a citizen of the Republic. Stanton was an absolutist, and her stance in favor of universal adult suffrage, her insistence that no one's liberation should take precedence over any other, was compelling. She and her friend Susan B. Anthony declared themselves the true radicals who best learned the lessons of anti-slavery, namely that all compromise with principle is dangerous. This was powerful stuff, which Stanton expressed as a moral imperative with which no thinking person could disagree. But thinking people did disagree. The right of woman to vote is as sacred in my judgment as that of man, Frederick Douglass insisted, and I am quite willing at any time to hold up both hands in favor of this right. What he argued in the face of mounting racist violence in the South was that the crisis faced by the black community was simply more extreme. And though Stanton refused to acknowledge it, and they were friends, and remarkably remained friends throughout this, but what Stanton refused to acknowledge was that his rhetoric was chilling. Douglass continued, when women, because they are women, are hunted down through the cities of New York and New Orleans, when they are dragged from their houses and hung upon lampposts, when their children are torn from their arms and their brains dashed out on the pavement, when they are objects of insult and outrage at every turn, when they are in danger of having their homes burned down over their heads, when their children are not allowed to enter schools, then they will have an urgency to obtain the ballot equal to our own. Unable or unwilling to hear this argument, and feeling betrayed by her friends, male and female both, who seemed prepared to trade away women's rights, Stanton could have stuck to the lofty rhetoric of universal justice. Instead, fired up with indignation and insult, she let loose some extraordinarily racist remarks to the effect that white women, educated white women, were more fit to vote than recently emancipated African American men. Protected by the 13th Amendment, Stanton declared, the black man is declared free, but, this is still quoting her, as the celestial gate to civil rights is slowly moving on its hinges, it becomes a serious question whether the representative women of the nation had better stand aside and see Sambo walk into the kingdom first. As for black women, she said, their emancipation is but another form of slavery, worse than what they endured under white slaveholders. It is better, Stanton declared firmly, if inexplicably, to be the slave of an educated white man than of a degraded, ignorant black one. Asked straight out whether she was, quote, willing to have the colored man enfranchised before the woman, she said no. I would not trust him with all my rights. Degraded, oppressed himself, he would be more despotic with the governing power than even our Saxon rulers are. Furious at friends who would postpone women's suffrage in order to gain the right to vote to black men, she turned the full force of her anger and resentment, clothed in her identification as a true and worthy American, on black men themselves. To Elizabeth Cady Stanton, the battle over the 15th Amendment was a battle between the sexes, in which all men had joined forces to declare an aristocracy of sex. At the same time, she insisted that there were better and worse orders of manhood. Just so, if woman finds it hard to bear the oppressive laws of a few Saxon fathers, she observed, what may she not be called upon to endure when all the lower orders, natives and foreigners, Dutch, Irish, Chinese, and African, legislate for her and her daughters? If such men were lifted, politically speaking, above to an equal level, she said, woman touches the lowest depths of her political degradation. For American women of wealth, education, virtue, and refinement, notice which women she's talking about when she says women, would then be ruled by these lower orders. Stanton remained oblivious to the hurt, in her friend Frederick Douglass's words, when he objected to her, quote, employment of certain names, such as Sambo and the Gardener and the Bootblack and the Daughters of Jefferson and Washington, and all the rest that I cannot coincide with. Yet there was more at stake here than mere figures of speech, thoughtless slips of the tongue and pen. In staking her claim to universal rights on the basis of a priority of white women's rights, Stanton did damage to her friendships, her movement, her claims to the purest radicalism, and her legacy to feminism itself. A principled consistency can be thrilling, and certainly Stanton's fiery words in behalf of women's rights offer stunning moments of political absolutism in the American political tradition. But in real life, there were choices to be made, and they were rarely as easy or obvious as she implied. But I don't think that the conflict over the 15th Amendment was one simply between principle and expediency. Rather, it signaled very different views of the ongoing nature of racism and racial violence. And I have picked just a few images here of what was going on in the South. This is from the Colfax Massacre after the Civil War. For Stanton, abolitionism and emancipation were prelude. Slavery was a metaphor of the door that reformers had pushed open to introduce the world to the cause of women's liberty. The consequences of African Americans' emancipation were not to Stanton the central crisis for her generation and her country, for she insisted with the end of slavery, the Negro question was over. She wrote in 1868, "The curtain has fallen on the last act. The lights are extinguished and the audience gone to their homes." This is at a time of enormous upsurge in racist violence. In the face of this terrible racial violence throughout the South in the post-war period, Stanton, who boasted of her genius for napping, did not lose much sleep. Stanton's elitism did not fade with Reconstruction, disappointing historians and admirers who wish it had been a temporary lapse of judgment. Outraged that women were excluded from the rights granted to less worthy men, she came to support an educational requirement for suffrage. For, she said, raising foreigners above the most intelligent, highly educated women, native-born Americans, was the most bitter drop in the cup of grief that we are compelled to swallow. And cartoons and images of this persisted. That's more post-Civil War cartoons. This. See, what a woman, this is much later, but it shows how this idea that you judge voters and the right to vote based on people's worth, what a woman may be and yet not have the vote, everything, right? Mayor, nurse, mother. What a man may have been and yet not lose the vote, right? Convict, lunatic, drunkard. I mean, the idea that the vote is somehow, your right to the vote is measured in some way by your moral worth was something that Stanton carried through in ways that were pretty discriminatory. Her outrage at being left out had always been nourished by her bone-deep conviction that she was an American, a citizen whose rights had been arbitrarily denied on the basis of sex. That part's true. Her radical insight that women deserved all the rights granted to male citizens remained infused with and was damaged by that sense of entitlement. In this sense, she was more like the nation's founders than she admitted. For like them, Stanton failed or refused to look too closely or too critically at her own complex place in the society she wished to change. Her support for women's suffrage and individual rights themselves on the basis of this powerful sense of class and cultural superiority may have served only to convince immigrants African Americans, and working class activists of both sexes that the movement for women's rights was primarily for white, middle class, native-born women. It was an image that has been difficult to shake. For me, as a scholar, with due credit to all the black feminist thinkers who've helped guide my thinking, the main issue is not about the priority of goals. Whose right should come first? No one wins that debate. More interesting for later generations of feminists and historians, I think, is which goals get defined as women's rights in the first place. Elizabeth Cady Stanton was a master at declaring particular goals: the vote, property rights, divorce reform, education, an end to the influence of biblical texts, whatever she saw as the major reform. She was fabulous at declaring those the universal goals as the real and symbolic changes that would make women finally free and equal citizens. What she failed to acknowledge was that she did not and could not take all women's circumstances, disabilities, needs, priorities, or rights into account in declaring hers the universal platform. She could not truly speak for all women when she said she did. We need to ask, I think, not just whether women's rights are on the table, but which women get to define those rights. Whose desperate needs count among the rights demanded by women? Not to go on a tangent about this, but we see this again in the debate in many media lately about Sheryl Sandberg's talk about women, as if all women were clinging to and climbing the very upper limits of the corporate ladder, or for that matter, whether that was all that feminism was ever about. But take the vote, which many Americans, and certainly American history textbooks, consider the central right that women lacked, demanded, and then gained. The vote, as Stanton saw it, was a radical demand, and it was courageous and breathtaking for her to make it. But it was also deeply imbued with Stanton's and the nation's founders' assumption that rights were exercised on individual terms, that the vote was a measure of independence, of adulthood, of the individual's pursuit of happiness, and of freedom itself. Within other communities, notably recently emancipated African American communities, the meaning of the vote may have been different, and other rights of citizenship, owning land, protecting one's children, having recourse to law, may have mattered as much. As the historian Elsa Barkley Brown has shown in her work on Richmond, Virginia, for instance, for newly freed African Americans, the vote was less an individual than a community possession. Sure, it was an important symbol of freedom, but it was even more an essential tool for self and community protection. Far more than white women, African American women in the Reconstruction South, although voteless, attended conventions and elections, spoke out at meetings, and expected to be heard on a wide range of community issues. They kept their men in line if they drifted from the Republican Party. They argued forcefully for more radical positions on women's rights as they defined them. For these women, the vote was essential, but it mattered less who individually exercised it, so long as it was used explicitly in the larger interests of their besieged and threatened community. Perhaps if we consider the meanings of the vote and rights in general in more complicated ways, we might understand how narrow a perch Stanton sat on when she claimed that hers was the universal position on women's rights. Elizabeth Cady Stanton left a huge legacy, and it gets no smaller by complicating it. For all her limitations, few 19th century women loom quite as large. Like the men we call the nation's founding fathers, she took what she viewed as simple truths and wove them into a philosophy of rights that, once expressed, seemed almost too obvious to debate. Stanton didn't invent the notion of equal rights, and she was not the first to demand that those rights be granted to women. But she grabbed the ideas that floated around her, shook them hard, shaped them into words that were strong and accessible, mixed the whole thing with a good dose of charm and charisma, and flung them back into a world forcefully enough to move countless others to act. This is a march in Washington 100 years ago this week in demand for women's suffrage, after Stanton had died, but nevertheless I think it's just beautiful. Elizabeth Cady Stanton never could focus on just one goal, and the vote was no exception. Each and every time, she was sure that she had found what she called the one true cause of women's subordination, whether it was in man's idea of his sexual rights or the oppression of women in ancient biblical texts. She could hardly contain her glee at her own cleverness, and wrote happily to her long-suffering friend, Susan B. Anthony, whenever she had moved on. My feeling, Stanton declared at 75, is to tone up rather than tone down. The possibility of Stanton toning down was not, I think, a major concern of Anthony's, who, although devoted to her friend, was sometimes exhausted by her galloping intellect. Stanton herself was happiest, she said, when hurling my thunder at both friends and opponents. And yet, she was not able to evaluate her own prejudices, her racism, or her astonishing self-regard, nor could she acknowledge the moral complexity of those who disagreed with her. All of us here, not to mention our students, breathe the air of that legacy, one that celebrates ideas that seem old-fashioned: liberty, equality, independence, and individualism. So we should applaud her insights and praise her work, and then hurl some thunder back. Thank you.